Welcome to the Centennial Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series, hosted in partnership with the president of Colorado Christian University, Dr. Donald Sweeting. Tonight, for the president. He's a great president. Tonight we are welcoming Dr. Kim Holmes, author of the book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind, How Groupthink and Intolerance Define the Left. To kick us off this evening, please welcome the president of Colorado Christian University, Dr. Donald Sweeting.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Great to have you here. We're thrilled that you're here. You know, every day, the news stories about the disorientation of American higher education, they just keep rolling out one day after another, 1 week after another. And so it was about a year and a half ago, in May, I was reading one of the book reviews in the Wall Street Journal, again, about the state of higher education and other things. And there was a particular book that intrigued me. It was called The Closing of the Liberal Mind, How Groupthink and Intolerance Define the Left. And so I read the review and I thought, I've got to get the book. And it intrigued me for several reasons. First of all, it intrigued me because it spoke to the tumult on American campuses today. I wanted to know about that as I was thinking about Colorado Christian University, and I wasn't here yet. It was also a takeoff on Alan Bloom's book in the title, The Closing of the American Mind, a very important book written back in 1987 about a radical change in American higher education. It also, this book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind, attempted to make sense of the morphing of American liberalism, why it was changing, how to understand it. And it identified something that I think is one of the biggest issues in American life today, that is, how do we define liberty? And so I bought the book, and it turned out to be one of my best reads for last year. And I appreciate it for many reasons. I appreciate it because, Dr. Holmes, you explain the recent, in fact, you explained it before they took place, the recent series of university non-free speech events. You helped make sense of that. You also tied everything in with the larger intellectual, spiritual crisis in our land, the crisis of American liberalism. You helped explain the postmodern left as a new illiberal progressive force and its trajectory. And you recapitulated themes that have been stated by one educational critique after another, Russell Kirk, Kroneman, Anthony Bloom, and others. And so you helped us connect the dots. And so if you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to buy the book and to read it. I think it will be helpful to you as it was to me. So Dr. Holmes is a distinguished fellow and former vice president at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He's the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. He published works including Rebound, Getting America Back to Great, Liberty's Best Hope, American Leadership for the 21st Century. He has an MA and a PhD in history from Georgetown University with a focus on European and American history. Would you welcome tonight Dr. Kim Holmes?
Thank you very much. That's a lot to live up to. It's a real pleasure, a real honor to be here this evening. When I saw the lines sort of snaking around the corner, you know, I kind of remember back to my high school days when I used to play in a rock band, and I always dreamed of having large audiences. Who would know I'd have to write a book about intellectual history to get such a line. But I especially want to thank President Don Sweeting for the honor of being part of the President's lecture series. Normally when I speak at universities, I frankly brace myself for hostility, but I know I don't have to worry about that at Colorado Christian University. It has a reputation, as all of you know far better than I do, for higher learning, but also more important for an open heart and an open-mindedness to inquiry. I congratulate and applaud you, Dr. Sweeting, for your appointment as president. You've been here now for a year, I understand, about a little bit less than a year. I'm sure everyone's glad to have you here. I'm glad you're here, and I really appreciate you inviting me here to speak this evening. As Dr. Sweeting said, I'm here to talk about my book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind. It is an intellectual history of progressive liberalism, or what we come to call liberalism today, and how it has changed, particularly over the last 50 years. But the book is also a commentary about the state of affairs in the country. I try to provide some historical perspective on some of the changes that all of us have witnessed on the universities and elsewhere in politics. Now, people may agree or may disagree whether or not I have succeeded in the book, but I hope at least to have started a conversation about a rather unknown side to the history of American liberalism. Now, what I argue in the book is today what we call progressive liberalism has veered far from what we normally understand as classic liberalism. The philosophies of John Locke, Adam Smith, James Madison, Alex de Tocqueville, Francois Guizot in France, and John Stuart Mill in Britain are something quite different from what we call liberalism today. I argue that liberalism has strayed, frankly, from its original meaning, becoming nearly the opposite of what was originally intended by the birth of classic liberalism in the 19th century. If you look up the word liberal in the dictionary, and I did that at the beginning of me writing the book, you will find these following words. Just look it up. A liberal is, quote, broad-minded. A liberal is, quote, open-minded. A liberal is supposed to be tolerant of different and diverse points of view. This is all from Webster's. I'm not making it up. The motto is supposed to be, you may disagree with me, but you have every right to your opinion. That used to be a classic liberal principle. Above all, no one has a right to deny you or me our freedom of expression or our freedom of conscience, even our freedom of religious conscience. In the marketplace of ideas, competition must always be kept open. You must argue your points using reason and facts. There's no settled science, and the secular ends of history are always open-ended. I emphasize secular there. Checks and balances must be maintained in government and the law to ensure in a democratic republic, a liberal democratic republic, that no one single partisan ideology prevails forever, for all. The rule of law is sacrosanct, meaning equality before the law, regardless of your economic, social, or political position, your class, your race, your gender, or your opinions, or your ideology. You must be treated in a courtroom equally by the law. There's no hate speech, there's only speech. Now, by these standards, today's liberals have a problem. Speech codes and safe spaces on campuses are just stifling dissent and shutting down debate. We see it all the time. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are spent at UC Berkeley to protect the life and security of controversial conservative speakers like Ben Shapiro. But what is most alarming about this attack on free speech is that it is often waged by young people. A recent poll conducted by scholars from the Brookings Institution and the University of California at Los Angeles showed just how bad things have gotten. In this poll, 4 in 10 students said that the First Amendment did not protect so-called hate speech. Half of the students said it was acceptable to shut down a public speaker with whom they disagreed. And most chilling of all, 19% actually said it was permissible to use violence to prevent a controversial speaker from talking. 19%. Now think about that. The whole point of the First Amendment is to protect controversial speech. It's not needed to protect happy talk. And yet a significant number of our university students, and I'm sure I'm not speaking for the students in this room, I wouldn't be raising it if I did think that, but a significant number of our university speakers across the country agree with the worst of the world's dictators that if someone disagrees with them, coercion should be used to shut them up. That's what dictators do. They do it all over the world. And they do it in the name of order, they do it in the name of morality, they do it in the name of all kinds of things. And increasingly they do it in Europe by using hate speech codes. Now, how we got to this point where speech is equated with violence, which is what's behind very often the hate speech ideology is a very long story, and I don't have time to go into it here. It's partly, frankly, a changing cultural norm where parents and teachers bend over backwards to shelter children from unpleasant experiences and offensive speech. But the deeper cultural and intellectual cause is a disrespect for different points of view, which used to be the essence of classic liberalism. Now, the left's attack on free speech is positively Orwellian, if anybody remembers who George Orwell is. It turns the whole value system of freedom upside down. Intolerance is practiced in the name of tolerance. Closed-mindedness is perpetrated and practiced in the name of open-mindedness. And in some instances, violence is perpetrated in the name of peace. Orwell said that the essence of thought control is to turn the plain meaning of words into their opposites. And that is exactly what is happening today with American liberalism. The coercive element of modern progressivism goes beyond speech. It is now quite common for progressives to use the force of law or regulations or executive fiat to control the boundaries of political discussion. Progressive attorneys general, for example, have issued court subpoenas against so-called climate change deniers. And some of their supporters in the media have actually said the climate change deniers should be tried, quote, as war criminals. Now, it is plain to see that many progressive liberals today have become the opposite of a liberal-minded person, as I define them in the Webster's Dictionary. Many of them are intolerant, closed-minded, and in a word, even illiberal. And all too often they use public shaming rituals and coercion to not only stifle dissent, but also to shut down public debate. Now, I wrote this book because I wanted to tell the story of how this happened. But most importantly, I wanted to tell the history of how this happened, because it's frankly a very long history, as you will hear if you can stay awake through the end of the speech, to explain it's not really about coddled children or changing cultural norms. It's actually, more importantly, about the changing of ideas. And the ideas that have been accepted in this country to mean X or now mean Y, mean something entirely different. And it's been a very long road how it happened, and I want to say a few words about how that happened. Now, before I dive into these ideas, I'd like to be clear about something. It's fair to say that some people who call themselves conservatives are as intolerant and closed-minded as leftists are. I will admit that. And I'm not even speaking here of white supremacists or Nazis, whom I don't consider to be conservatives, who are plainly intolerant. Perhaps someday I will write a book about them. But for now, I wanted to write a book to focus on progressives, mainly because not enough is said about this illiberal streak that's in American liberalism. The truth of the matter is that too many Americans can't even imagine, much less admit, that progressive liberalism can even be intolerant at all. That's why I wanted to write the book. So let's get to it. The first point is that I want to make is that progressive liberalism that we see today is not your parents' liberalism or your grandparents' liberalism, depending on how old you are. It's not the liberalism of Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy or even Lyndon Johnson, frankly. They had some respect for the values of freedom of speech. They believed in political pluralism, and they also, by and large, had a respect for Western values in the family. It's not even the liberalism of Woodrow Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt, other great progressives of the turn of the 20th century. If Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt were alive today, they would be horrified by the upside-down world of identity politics. Frankly, today's liberalism is not even the kind that existed under, that has particularly emerged over the last 10 years under the presidency of Barack Obama. It's not even the liberalism of President Bill Clinton. He was proud to be known as a moderate New Democrat. Remember that? You will recall that in the 90s, Clinton disavowed the militant left with his Sister Souljah moment. But those days are long over. During the presidential campaign, he was forced to apologize to a group of protesters who were trying to shout him down. The difference between the old and the new Bill Clinton shows just how much progressivism has changed in the span of 2 decades. Today's progressivism, what I call the postmodern left, is a child of the left, of the new left of the 1960s. It was influenced by neo-Marxists such as Herbert Marcuse. The new left wanted to make a cultural revolution, not an economic one. It wanted to revolutionize culture, but most importantly, it wanted to revolutionize how we understood morality, how we understood what the good life was, and how we understood what our personal responsibility as human beings are to each other. You can't get more basic than that in a culture and in a civilization, and that's exactly where the new left targeted it. They went right at the heart of American culture. They had a unique talent, the new left did, for finding ever new issues such as sexual politics, environmentalism, to advance not only the cause of radical egalitarianism, a cause that has been with the left since the French Revolution, but also the left's age-old war on capitalism. But they were updating how they did it. It wasn't Marx anymore, it was Marcuse. It wasn't the proletariat, it was a cultural revolution of values of the middle class. Now, sometimes today, this left that came out of the 60s, the new left, sometimes they're called the multicultural left. And that is fine as far as it goes. But to me, the word multicultural doesn't quite capture the historical and philosophical nature of the left as we see them today. Postmodernism, which I will talk about in a bit more what I mean by that, is an identifiable philosophical and historical phenomena that definitely shaped the evolution of the left. And to my mind, talking about the ideas of postmodernism helps better explain the totality of the ideas that exist in the left across the board. Okay, what is postmodernism? It's a fancy word. I fully admit it's not the best word in the world. Anytime you have a word that you got to explain over and over again, you're not doing a very good job communicating, but I'm afraid I'm not the one who invented the term. I'm as a historian giving you, telling you the history of something. That's what they call themselves, and so I will have to tell you what this means. Postmodernism is the belief that morality is relative, that truth is subjective, and that facts are elastic. Multiculturalism is a subset of this larger worldview as applied to the world's cultures. It proclaims that all cultures are supposedly equal in value, equal, however, in all but one, that is, Western culture, which is decidedly inferior and decidedly oppressive. In the postmodern worldview, freedom and even reality are, quote, fictions. They're nothing more than social constructs created by our interpretations of our positions in society. And absolute freedom, they actually use the term, and perfect equality are absolutely achievable. How? By using the power of the state and the law to create that society and to enforce it. There is no difference in the postmodern mindset that exists between human beings that cannot be completely erased, provided the state has enough authority, enough power, and enough money to get the job done. Now, you may think that the postmodern left is a fringe element, and it was in the 60s and the 70s. But think again. Most of America's popular culture and most of its major institutions are nearly fully occupied by the values of the postmodern left. America's most important institutions, its schools, its mainline universities, its mainline churches, the arts and entertainment industry for sure, most community groups, and much of the corporate world, and much of the legal profession are infused with, if not dominated by, the values of the postmodern left. How did this happen historically? How did this once fringe element become so dominant? Like with most things cultural in this country, as I said, it started in the 1960s. And it was during that decade that the New Left decided it would, and this is the phrase that they use, march through the institutions. The Germans said the same thing, by the way. This was actually, it was a concept that the left in America took from the German left. But that was what they said. We will march through all the institutions. We'll not concern ourselves so much with certainly not revolution, but not politics, but we will march through the institutions. The radicals of the Students for Democratic Action, the SDS, they stepped back from revolution. Terrorists like Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn, they turned in their bombs for academic titles and honors. The left shook off their sandals, they cut their hair, put on suits and ties to look as perfectly bourgeois and middle class as possible. They did the whole Alinsky thing, that is, hiding their radical goals by fitting into society and advocating not revolution, but slow evolutionary change one step at a time. And doing it mainly not through politics so much, but through changing the cultural norms of the education system, the way we see ourselves, the way we practice our religions, as I said, the institutions of the country. Because they knew, and they actually said this in all of their, in the studies that they had written, if you control the institutions, you control the politics. They went on school boards, they became professors, academic chairpersons, and presidents. They were elected to university boards, and even controlled the leadership of many America's mainline churches. They have worked their way into every major institution in America to the point to where they and their children are now largely America's ruling class. Mostly in the big urban areas, mostly in the big cities, but the big cities are mostly where the commanding heights of America's culture come from, through television, entertainment, and through the control of the media. Okay, that's the social history. But what about the history of ideas? How did they change? The first thing the postmodern left did was to take on the very essentials of the American culture, as I mentioned before, its virtues, its morality, its traditions, and the ideas of constitutional government that have been at its core. And they had two intellectual weapons of choice to do this. And they operated mostly in the universities and intellectual circles early on to do this, to make sure that they had done their homework, they had the ideas, they had the arguments, they had the methods, so that would give them the confidence to go out and teach younger people about all this and infuse them with these new ideas. So now we're going to get into a little bit of philosophy here, if you'll bear with me. The first intellectual tool they used was what's called the analytical and discursive method of deconstructionism. Deconstructionism. It's a big fancy word, but they invented it. The ideas of Western civilization, religion, and the American founding were unpacked. They were deconstructed. We got to the bottom of their lies and their flaws, and how certain classes of people were fooling other classes of people, and that everything we had learned in our civics class and we had learned in our pulpits were not only wrong, they were lies. That's deconstruction. The second weapon was straight out of the philosophical toolbox of postmodernism, namely the ideas of what the philosophers call ethical and epistemic relativism. That is, it's fancy words for the belief that virtue is relative and truth is unknowable. Virtue is relative and truth is unknowable. And therefore, everything you've been taught about truth is a lie. It's wrong. Now, if all morality is relative, then who needs it? We can destroy the old morality and create something new to take its place. And that was the whole point of the intellectual exercise, was to create a new normal. The old normal was bad. Destroy it, deconstruct it, create something in its place. We will do that through our intellectual exercises. And it worked. It worked. Slowly but surely, the culture changed. People 20 years ago would have laughed if you had said that the Pentagon should be paying for the operation of transgender service members. And yet, that is now where we are. This is no joke. It actually has an effect. If the new normal, if the new truth is relative, in other words, totally subjective, then men and women are completely free to do what? Define their own realities. That's the phrase they would use. To pursue their own pleasures, to decide who they are and what they are by themselves, with no need to reference natural law, religion, or even, and this is important, even the greater good of society doesn't matter. Not only is God dead in this narrative, so too are Western morality and the traditional American political system. Now, the postmodern left look to be, to most people in the universities and the media, if you talk to some political activists, they seem to be all about expanding the horizons of freedom. That's what it looked like to be. It was, in this guise, a very powerful intellectual and even emotional cause. It promised to replace the old hard virtues of thrift, abstinence, and self-denial, all those hard things that are so hard to do, with the new age values of pleasure, personal satisfaction, and self-fulfillment. You notice I'm not talking about politics here? I'm not talking, Democrat, Republican. I'm talking about the basics of human existence and human value. That's why it was so powerful. That's why it worked, because it went to the core of who we are. Now, politically, historically, instant gratification isn't really all that attractive. If the selfishness of the 1970s me generation, which is where this really got started, were the only things that the left had going for them, it might not have gotten very far. Because, selfishness, the me generation, is not really politically very attractive. It's kind of hard to go out and say, well, it's all about me all the time, and people applaud. Okay, you can do that, at a Hollywood award ceremony. They like that sort of thing. But if you go out into regular America, they get kind of tired of people bragging about themselves. So the new left, the postmodern left, came up with an alternative. They decided to turn this whole rush and this whole campaign of selfish interests and self-fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, they decided to turn it into rights. Sexual affairs were no longer about promiscuity, but liberation. Sexual relations between gay partners, for example, were not about their own pleasures, but about equality. And as of late, even such supposedly traditional values as commitment in marriage. The trend was to socialize not only personal desires, but also group identity rights. Under the new multicultural code, if you were a member of a protected minority, defined by sexual orientation, race, gender, you would now have the power, under this new system of rights, to insist on complete personal control over how society and the law treat you. You now had the power to impose your own personal definitions of words that you deem to be offensive about your condition in society on the rest of society. In the extreme case of the Antifa, you even have the moral, but not the legal, right to employ violence against those who offend you. Now, it's quite an amazing juxtaposition of ideas, if you think about it. Your personal, subjective desires, feelings, thoughts, provided they are in the service, as they understand it, of minority rights, are now justified as social causes. The personal is now social. If you claim victimhood, your personal preferences and opinions on sexuality, race, and even gender must be given priority of place in public opinion under the law. That claim can even be used to control what other people say about you. Freedom of speech must be subordinated to the new higher public good of how that person feels about themselves. Thus was invented the cause of social justice. Not just justice, but social justice. Liberals would create a new hierarchy of social groupings based on sex, gender, and race. And the goal of the state and the purpose of the law were not to impartially weigh evidence and apply blind justice to individuals, which had been the way justice had always been practiced in America. Rather, they were to make sure that certain groups of individuals received preferential treatment over others. Now, this represents a momentous change in the history of Western liberalism, not just American, but Western liberalism. If you were 50, 60 years ago, a socialist or a social democrat, normally you would have believed that the inherent selfishness of identity politics, of the kind represented by the multicultural left, was the bitter enemy of the broad community. You would say it was antisocial. To care mainly about personal desires or about the special interests or the interests of special groups which Karl Marx had once called classes, at the expense of the whole community was considered to be antisocial and therefore an anathema. It's the way socialists from the 50s all the way back had understood what socialism was all about. And if you'll notice, some old-fashioned socialists today even have a hard time with identity politics. We should not be surprised that a socialist like Bernie Sanders doesn't really get along with some of these identity politics activists. The latter are interested in not the whole community, that a socialist would be, but in certain groups and how they need to be preferred in the new scheme of social justice. Now let me pause here for a moment to summarize. I'm describing how the postmodern left changed liberalism, how specifically it changed the classic liberal ideas, mainly of individualism and equality. But to provide a fuller explanation, though, I got to dig deeper, a little bit deeper into the actual ideas and the philosophies of the matter. So we're going to get into a little bit of intellectual history here. Let's start with the idea of individualism. The most radical intellectual change in liberalism involves how it views the individual. The postmodern left views the individual as being absolutely free and absolutely sovereign in deciding all morality, regardless of tradition, religion, natural law, or even the good of society. You see this viewpoint not only in the postmodern philosophers in France, so Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, but also in the contemporary philosophers of American liberalism in our universities, which have been enormously influential over the last 30 years. People like Michael Walzer, Ronald Dworkin, Richard Rorty, who were directly influenced by these French postmodern philosophers who developed the philosophy that I gave you, particularly the idea of the free individual. Now, this view of the individual is not the same as a classic liberal understanding of someone like John Locke or Jefferson and Madison. It's not how individualism in America through our history, rugged or otherwise, was understood at all in the American lexicon. Followers of Locke, followers of Madison and Jefferson, they believed that the individual was endowed with rights by God and by natural law. There were objective constraints on the individual imposed not only by society, but also by morality and also by religion. Jefferson and Madison were not followers of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a forerunner of the postmodernists who believed that the radically free will of the individual alone decided what was right and wrong, regardless of what God, regardless of what natural law had to say about the matter. Now, wedding this new idea of freedom, what I call radical individualism, this is the way I kind of keep all these ideas straight. You've got to give them a name. This is radical individualism. Wedding these ideas with socialist notions of equality is the essence of what the postmodern left did in the intellectual transformation of liberalism. It is a radical individualism tied to the ethos of socialism. How many of you have heard of Noam Chomsky? Chomsky is a poster boy for this. Chomsky says, I am a libertarian socialist. Now, anybody who knows anything about ideas knows that libertarianism and socialism are at the opposite end of the spectrums. One believes in the radical freedom of the individual, and socialism believes in no freedom for the individual at all. Yet he sees what I'm talking about here, he grasps it, and one of the reasons why most people think he's so brilliant is because he did this. He took these two intellectual traditions that had historically been on opposite sides of the spectrum, fused them together, and said, I'm all about radical freedom and justice. Oh, that sounds good. Social justice and radical freedom. And personal radical freedom, too. I can do anything I want. I get to define who I am and what I want. That sounds pretty attractive. And on top of that, I get to insist that other people must agree with me. And if they don't, I can have the government fine them or put them in jail. Amazing. In identity politics, what you see here is people get to define who they are. And since their personal views and desires hold sway over everybody else, it's their interpretations of what discrimination is that becomes the equivalent of a social mandate, a demand on the claim of opinions of others, a demand on what you are allowed to say in the public square, enforced by law. So, and also not just behavior, but speech. Now, once this demand that I'm talking about here, and I talked about this a minute before, once it becomes considered to be a social right, which it is, the argument is over, because rights in the American constitutional system can become law. In the brave new world of the left, people must accept the personal opinions of certain kinds of people. This is a momentous change. Equality is no longer about economics, but it's about where you stand in the great cultural conflict between the new official groupings of society. John Podesta, remember him from the election? In the WikiLeaks, he was caught in one of his emails when he was still working for Hillary Clinton in the campaign. He was talking about how Hillary Clinton's campaign, that the purpose of it politically was to mobilize what he called all the food groups of the Democratic Party. That's what he called them. In other words, race, gender, and all of those. Mobilize them, get them to believe that only the Democratic Party will deliver on what they want, and also it'll polarize the rest of society to the point where they have to choose between the brave new world of identity politics or Donald Trump. That's really what he was saying. Now, if you look at the history of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, you see a big difference here about how social justice and civil rights in particular are interpreted. In this view of equality, you gain your individual rights not by what you share with all of humanity, which is the liberal civil rights view. Blacks were considered to be equal to all human beings. They weren't considered to be better or worse. They were considered to be equal. And it wasn't because they were black, but because they were humans. That's why they had human rights. That was the old way of looking at civil rights. And all the men, regardless of skin color, as understood in the original civil rights, this is the way Martin Luther King looked at it. But in the new postmodern left, you have your rights by virtue of your membership, of course, in one of these groups. If you belong to a persecuted minority, you, as an individual, share in the persecution of the whole group. It doesn't matter whether you have been individually persecuted or not. What matters is the historic and social position of your race and your gender. If you are on the wrong side of that divide historically, you are by definition the aggressor, while the other side is a victim. Now, in America, civil rights, particularly under King and others, had always been grounded in the moral behavior of the individual. Martin Luther King Jr. hated group stereotyping. He considered group stereotyping to be the essence of racism against African Americans. That's why he hated it. That's why he talked not about the color of an individual's skin, but about the content of one's character. He wanted African Americans to be judged on the content of their characters, not their race. Now it's completely upside down. Somebody who is historically determined to be a persecuted minority can go out and misbehave in all kinds of ways, can attack people or go in and steal something from a store. But if in a certain narrative in the news, if they happen to be considered the victim of, here in this grand historical narrative, of persecution and oppression, then their individual behavior does not matter the slightest. That is not something Martin Luther King would have approved of. Now, individual moral behavior in these matters is practically meaningless. The only thing that matters is the group's status. Now, the fundamental change of liberalism I'm describing here, frankly, it has a long history that goes back before the 60s. And the reason why I'll try to explain here, I'll end by talking about Charlottesville. And thinking, so if you get worried about me getting bogged down in 17th century history here, I end up in Charlottesville. So there's a purpose to this. This long story really goes back to the Enlightenment, the 17th and 18th centuries. And what you see is the postmodern left is a fusion of two entirely different historical traditions from the Enlightenment. One of these traditions stemmed from what historians call the radical Enlightenment. This is the intellectual movement that arose first in the 17th century with Baruch Spinoza. Then it was picked up by Denis Diderot, Pierre Bayle, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the other French philosophers. And it is the root of the tradition not only of the French Revolution, but also of Western socialism and the more radical revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly the Bolshevik Revolution. Its clarion calls are égalité, egalitarianism, and social revolution. It mainly speaks French and German, particularly in the case of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who quite consciously tried to synthesize the ideas of Enlightenment into a philosophy. Now, that's the radical. It's mostly French, mostly German. The radical Enlightenment is to be distinguished from what historians call the moderate Enlightenment. This is the philosophical tradition of Locke, of David Hume, Montesquieu, and Adam Smith. This was largely an Anglo-Scottish tradition, and it was picked up by America's founders, embodied to a large degree in the principles of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. This tradition mainly speaks English, with a little French thrown in from Montesquieu. And its clarion calls are not égalité, it's natural law, it's individual liberty in the context of natural law, religious liberty, and the freedom of the individual from government tyranny. Nearly the exact opposite of the liberalism of the French Revolution. Now, clearly, the postmoderns left embrace the radical tradition of the radical Enlightenment, particularly radical egalitarianism. But there's a twist here. And this is one of the reasons I decided to write the book, because I saw this twist and it was complicated, and I thought, how am I going to explain this? I studied intellectual history at Georgetown, and all my professors were Marxists, and so I got to read every Marxist you can ever imagine. So I got inside the heads of Marxists, particularly the cultural ones like Marcuse. And so I got to see from that perspective things that probably if you only studied Locke and Montesquieu or something like, you wouldn't see what was happening on the left. So there's an historical twist, and that is this. The radical individualism of the postmodern left that I took some pains to describe does not stem from this Lockean tradition, but from the radical Enlightenment, but more accurately from a fusion of ideas with those people who actually later not only developed some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, but more importantly, later on in the 19th century tried to reject it. Let me explain what I mean by that. Like most things that are bad with political theory, it always begins with Rousseau. The notion that the individual was radically free was first articulated by Rousseau. And he was, of course, as I said, one of the inventors of the radical Enlightenment. Now, while Rousseau's ideas about the social contract and the revolution that inspired the first socialism of the French Revolution existed, it was his theory about the rights of the natural human being that gave rise to the ideas that would later evolve into the radical individualism of the postmodern left that I've been describing. It's quite a different view of individualism from John Locke. It's particularly Rousseau. It was a sentimental view of human nature, particularly his idea that human beings were by nature good, and it had a huge impact on the rise of the Romantic movement in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Romanticism started out mainly as a literary movement, but eventually its ideas about the possibilities of radical human freedom made their way into philosophy, particularly German philosophy. They shaped specifically the philosophy of Kant, who believed in what he called absolute freedom. Locke did not talk about absolute freedom. David Hume did not talk about absolute freedom, not even Montesquieu. They don't know what it means. Kant talked about it. And he developed a philosophical system, mainly because he took Rousseau's idea of the sentimental human being and the idea of radical freedom and developed a philosophical system around that idea. But here's the twist that's not widely known. this romanticization of the individual, the belief that the secular individual could be completely free in a society, which is what I'm talking about here. This also became one of the very tenets of the rebellion against the Enlightenment in the early 19th century. This is where it starts getting a little confusing, so stay with me. It was mostly in Germany. Philosophers, Johann Gottfried Herder, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, these are philosophers that you don't normally hear of in America. They were traumatized by the French Revolution and by Napoleon's invasion of Europe. They may have absorbed some of Rousseau's ideas about the heroic man, but they became fierce critics of the Enlightenment because, like the Romantics before them, they equated the Enlightenment with the French Revolution and all the violence that it brought with it. They equated it with Napoleon. So, here was where the European right was born in a reaction to the Enlightenment. It was born in the early 19th century. It was a counter-reaction to the Enlightenment. It was a counter-revolution. It was not only against the liberalism of the French Revolution, but also against the more moderate version you found in Britain and America. It was taken up by nationalist movements in Germany and other parts of Europe and by other reactionaries who hated the French. So how did the ideas of the European right make their way into the postmodern left? The short answer is through our famous, friendly French postmodern philosophers. Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-Francois Lyotard. We've never heard of them. We go to the English department up at Yale. They're like gods up there, particularly since the 1970s. These French philosophers, who call themselves postmodernists, they worked in the middle of the 20th century, and their ideas were absorbed by the English, literature, philosophy, humanities, critical studies, legal departments of all of America's major universities, not just Yale, but also Harvard and Princeton, all of which became gateways of their ideas into the larger American culture. Now, these philosophers were highly influenced by the German philosophers who were part of this great reaction against the Enlightenment that I talked about. Who are these philosophers? It's Schopenhauer, it's Nietzsche, and most importantly, Martin Heidegger. Anybody ever heard of Heidegger? Nasty character. Yeah. They were all influenced by the supreme philosopher of relativism, historical relativism, which was, of course, Hegel. These are all Germans. These philosophers, in turn, had been heirs of the German idealist assault on the Enlightenment, of the kind you saw in France and Britain. Schopenhauer, who was a huge influence on Nietzsche, and others were the inventors of the modern notion of radical freedom. The same, by the way, notion of radical freedom you can find in radical libertarianism. Nietzsche famously said, God is dead, and he believed that human freedom resides solely in the will to power. Heidegger, who loved Nietzsche, who greatly influenced, by the way, the postmodernists, and who was a German Nazi for a while. He was the rector of the Freiburg University during Nazi Germany's time. Heidegger posited a near mystical idea of the heroic individual and the individual's potential for freedom. The individual was radically free to do or say whatever he pleases, provided that he or she embraces the terrible consequences of absolute freedom. You can hear echoes of existentialism in here, and Heidegger influenced existentialists in Paris too. But we're not talking about the existentialists. We're talking about these postmodern philosophers in France in the middle of the 20th century. They took up these ideas. They loved Heidegger, particularly the idea of the radically free individuals, and they turned them into this philosophical method that I described earlier. They talked about meta-narratives. They talked about the only reality is the interpretation of the narrative. The interpretation is subjective. And the human being is radically free to define his or her own destiny and his or her own morality. This comes straight from Schopenhauer, straight from Nietzsche, straight from the early European right, and made its way into the left through the philosophers of postmodernism. So we come full circle in the history of these ideas. We started out with Rousseau's belief in absolute freedom of the individual, regardless of tradition. We made our way through the Romantics, Then we made our way to the German idealists who picked up his idea of the heroic individual, but they left this old talk about the social contract behind because it was associated with the revolution. We passed through the radical relativism of Hegel, and then we moved to the great reaction against the Enlightenment overall, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, who made the central tenet of their philosophy was a war on Western liberalism, a war on the Enlightenment, a war on Western liberalism. So the point I'm making here is this idea of radical freedom that you find in the postmodern left was directly devised by philosophers who hated liberalism with a passion. Because they saw it as stale, they saw it as unheroic, and they, as good German philosophers who in their hearts always think of themselves as metaphysicians, they would devise a new reality and something bigger than these stale Americans and Brits who are always talking about contracts and laws and the like. Now, why is this important to know? Since I wrote this book, many of the trends I described in the book about polarization have become far more pronounced. I wrote this book in 14 and 15. And since the book came out, the divisions between the far left and the far right have gotten far worse. Now, after a neo-Nazi killed a demonstrator in Charlottesville, here I'm at Charlottesville, many people, including even some conservatives, questioned whether there were any similarities at all between the far left and the far right, between neo-Nazism, for example, and the Antifa anarchists, some of whom were in Charlottesville, but not all of them were. Now, in the aftermath of Charlottesville, the debate over the Confederate monuments, the contention that the, quote, two sides of the Charlottesville protests, as President Trump called them, were equally culpable in this whole affair, became highly controversial and highly contested, even by some conservatives. So here's the thing. The histories of the far left and the far right are different. I will give you that. They spring from different concerns, some different histories, and different ideologies. One claims to be cosmopolitan, caring about the overall community. The other, the far right, the neo-Nazis and the like, they're tribalistic. However, the two far extremes of left and right are definitely related historical phenomena, which is why I've taken such pains to give you the intellectual history of their ideas. They not only play off one another and copy each other's methods in terms of tactics, they also occupy the same historical side in the ideological standoff between the intellectual heirs of the radical enlightenment of France and Germany on one side and the moderate enlightenment of Britain and America on the other. The first led to the French and the Bolshevik revolutions and the counter-revolutions of Nazism and fascism. I'm trying to make the case that fascism and Nazism is inadvertently an heir of the radical enlightenment. It has nothing to do with religion. These were pagans. It was a civil war inside the radical movements of the people inside the radical enlightenment. But the second one, the modern enlightenment, led to the American Revolution and the modernization of the British Constitution. The first one, the radical enlightenment, gave us oppression. The second one gave us freedom and the rule of law. Now, the ideological similarities to this day between the far right and the far left are not merely that their methods can be totalitarian, and nor is it merely that Nazism and communism are two ideological peas in the same socialist pod, with Nazism being some kind of socialism because it's national socialism. Rather, it is that both movements spring, as I have argued, intellectually from the tendency and the radical enlightenment to want to create the perfect society, to give people absolute freedom at the expense of individual rights. The price of utopia, of trying to obtain absolute freedom of any kind, social or individual, is always going to be dictatorship. That's always going to be the end result. I don't care how good your intentions are, but if you try to push something to the absolute end, you're going to be coercing somebody and putting somebody in a camp. For the white supremacist, the utopia would be a race pure order. For the communist or the anarchist, it is a utopia of their idea of perfect equality. Either way, the state must have unlimited powers to create this new order, and the rights of the individual must be radically sacrificed for their idea of the greater good. But there's another similarity. Both radicals, left and right, emphasize group rights. They emphasize group rights. What I call in my book, the subtitle, Groupthink. For Nazis, the preferred group is, of course, the master race, or the nation, while for leftists, it is people they deem to be socially oppressed. Each contests the moral claims of the other side's group, but is nonetheless irrevocably true that both white supremacists and multicultural radicals embrace the groupthink of identity politics. One just happens to be white, the other ones have a different color. In both cases, it's the logic of tribal loyalty that prevails precisely because each side claims to be the victim of the other. Such groupthink is the polar opposite of the classic liberal tradition and its spin-off, modern conservatism, American conservatism, which profess the ideals of individual rights and a truly colorblind society, not based upon John Podesta's food groups. Now, all this may be true, but I think conservatives need to be careful about something. They need to be cautious when drawing moral equivalence between Nazis, communists, and anarchists. They need to be careful because of the terrible history of World War II. Sometimes pointing out similarities between the far left and the far right can be misunderstood. Witness the backlash against President Trump's attempt to make this very same point by using not exactly very precise language. So I think to combat a misunderstanding, we must make clear that in no way do we mean to downplay the unique historical experiences of African Americans, of Jews, and other minorities that have been victims of oppression of these far-right totalitarians. The fact that other classes of people have been singled out for persecution by communist and even fascist regimes does not change the singular evil nature of slavery and the Holocaust. I think, in this spirit, the best thing we can do is not to focus on our differences, but to rally around a common idea of liberty, both liberals and conservatives. But we will never understand the totality of the threat to liberty unless we understand that it comes from many different sides. It doesn't just come from one side. Whether a white supremacist or a communist, the one thing they share in common is their hatred of individual liberty. And they hate the rule of law. Standing up to both is necessary to protect the rights of majorities and minorities alike. You protect that system, it's the best way to make sure minorities are getting their rights protected. I think the bottom line is this. Unless we better understand the dark side of progressivism, we will always be prone to look the other way when it happens to move against our liberties. Not in an overt way, but an indirect way, as I have described here, through culture and through changing the definition of ideas to where we're not even sure what it means to be individually free anymore. We used to understand it, but now most of us are confused. If we assume, as many Americans do, that progressivism is only or mainly about equality or about simply being nice to one another or trying to be just, we will never see it when it slowly but inexorably moves in an authoritarian direction. Compassionate rhetoric is not enough. It's not enough to have the intentions to be compassionate. All too often, what we see in politics today, the language of compassion is a language of deception. What we need most of all is the truth and the courage to speak the truth, to ensure that the liberty our forefathers fought for shall not, as Abraham Lincoln once said, from the earth. Thank you for your patience for the history lecture. I got through it. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a few questions, and we're going to open it up. But
Sure.
so where, in your opinion, where is this all going? What's the trajectory of this? In your book, you talk a little bit about, the attempt to overthrow the traditional order, dismantle Western civilization. You ask, is it imploding? Yeah, just after all this study and everything and observing of trends, what do you see as the trajectory?
Well, we talked about this at the dinner table. I think that many of the examples of the left going too far and becoming downright authoritarian is becoming obvious to a lot of people. It's not, just the facts of the matter are not that hard to make. What's happening in the campuses, what's happening in the courts and the like. And I think that one of the reasons why Donald Trump got elected is because there were a lot of Americans out there who just felt that the country was slipping away from them, and this guy stood up and said, I'm not going to talk that way. I'm just going to call it the way I see it. And they go, finally, somebody has the courage to stand up and call something the truth. Now, whether or not he fully understands anything I'm saying here tonight, I'm not saying that. But I think that, he was sensing something in the country that they were sick and tired of being called deplorable. So there is something there. The other thing is that a lot of this philosophy that I talk about that was created in the universities for the last 40 years was put together by intellectuals, and they were teaching students, and the students would go out and become teachers in elementary schools and high schools and other colleges. And so that's how it was disseminated into the culture. But it did start, frankly, in the universities. All very sophisticated people, very educated. But as we were explaining at the dinner table, let's say that you're a truck driver, and let's say you've not had a college education. And so you don't know anything about deconstructionism, you haven't heard of Jacques Derrida, you don't know any of this stuff. But you go on the news and you see some guy who calls himself Chelsea Manning claiming he's a woman. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, but he's not. I mean, and then he looks around and why is it I have to say this again? I mean, it's completely outside this cultural debate that we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. But the point is it just, when you start going against reality and playing facts in front of your nose cannot be accepted, and they must be called something different. And that's what postmodernism was saying. They were saying facts are fiction. And this is their intellectual tradition. This didn't come out of nowhere. We actually have to fight back and say, no, it's not fiction. There are certain things that are real. Or we're going to stand up for the truth. But I must say that one thing conservatives we're not doing well enough is we're not fighting on the liberal intellectuals' turf. We're not fighting in their world. First of all, they don't want to let us on campuses, for one thing. That's one of the reasons why they just won't want to let us there, because they know that if we stand up in front of anybody with half a brain, not a lot of this is not that hard to dispute. But on the other hand, some of my conservative intellectuals are missing the boat, and they don't realize what they're up against. They don't realize that they've lost the culture, and they need to fight back and get it back. They think that they can just do legislation in Congress or elect the right president that'll do the trick. It's not enough. You have to do what the New Left did in the 60s. You have to retake the institutions. If you retake the institutions, the politics will follow. But it's long, hard work, folks. It's long and hard. It's not really about politics. It's about joining the PTA and the school boards and not letting nonsense about identity politics work their way in there. I sit on boards in Washington, and I'm always the token conservative. And there's 14 other board members, all of them liberal Democrats, and I'm the one conservative Republican sitting there. So they'll start passing resolutions, and I'm always the skunk at the party. I'm always saying, wait a minute, why are we doing that? And they go, okay, he's from the Heritage Foundation. We know what he thinks. And so we're always outnumbered. So we need to get the numbers up on these boards. And so we have not just one lone conservative voice and have everybody telling us whatever they think is the cause of the day. So even though it's a dire situation, you can't, maybe it's darkest before the dawn, because you can't really know what it is you need to do until you know what the problem is. And the problem isn't just politics, it's culture. It's ideas, and it's a refusal to be intimidated by New Age rhetoric. and it's what you get in the movies and you get it on TV. You know, individual freedom, as the American understood it, was a constrained idea. It was constrained by religion and by natural law and an obligation that I have to other individuals. That's how it worked. It wasn't about whatever I thought or wanted to do or what I felt like doing. That's considered to be selfish by most people who understand morality. And yet that's what today passes for social justice.
The Bible has a term for that. It's everybody did what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah.
You know, one of the helpful things about your book is you talk a little bit about classical liberalism. And, you know, liberalism is a term that's it can have different meanings depending on your context. It can be bad, it can be good. And you talk about the old liberalism as a conservative liberalism. So kind of an ordered liberty. How does a society restore the foundations of a liberal society? I mean, you're talking culture, but...
Well, the American genius, the genius of the American system is that you had a constitution of ordered liberty, which protected individual rights within the context of traditional values and in respect for religion. This is not the way it was in France. In France, the liberals and revolutionaries there wanted to get rid of the Catholic Church. In the American and the Anglo-American tradition, it was not only tolerating religion, it was partnering with religion. Because as Madison and certainly John Adams understood, and George Washington even mentioned it, if you have a civil society where people are showing constraint from morality and religion, that gives you the opportunity to have the freedom in the constitutional and political area, so long as you respect the individual rights and the freedom of religion of the individual. This is a totally American idea. You don't find this in Europe. That's one of the reasons why, or Canada, that's why they have so many hate laws, or hate crime laws, or hate crimes and hate speech laws up there. They regulate speech in Europe. You know, we have been protective of free speech because of the First Amendment, but the First Amendment is not just about speech, it's about freedom of religion.
Let's throw it open for questions. So we got a mic. Come on up and raise your hand, keep it high, and we'll take a few right off to my left.
If I had a whole suitcase of money and I was representing the conservative and I would hire you as a marketing firm, how would you market it?
I would, well, the Heritage Foundation, the Heritage Action, which is the lobbying arm of the Heritage Foundation, is putting together a program called Sentinels. And they're going into the cities, communities, counties, local areas, and basically signing up people to fight for the conservative agenda. They do it mostly on politics, mostly on legislation, mostly on policy. Now, what I would do is I would do something equivalent of that in the cultural area. You know, put together local committees and make sure that everybody is sort of on the same, singing from the same music on what the issues are, but then start targeting the institutions, the local institutions, the school boards, and not just letting the left dominate everything at the local level. And then working your way up to the state. You know, if you had these groups, the first thing though is they have to be educated. When I wrote this book, I did 140 radio interviews promoting the book, and so very often they were on talk radio, and they would be late at night, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, you know, some sleepy place somewhere, and I thought, okay, I had to be careful about all this history because you have to kind of know it in order to get it. So I didn't talk so much about the history, but I talked about the other things. They were talking about what's happening to the culture. Almost everybody I talked to were hungry for this sort of thing. They kind of felt, but what do we do? They kept on saying, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And I said, well, whatever you do, don't put all your hope in Washington, because Washington cannot change the culture. That's not the way the New Left did it. They didn't do it out of Congress. What they did to the Democratic Party is that was the last thing they took over. It wasn't the first, it was the last. It was like an occupation. And so I would have more activist groups trying to get involved in everything, in the entertainment industry, who you invite, but also, frankly, we need to engage the universities. I mean, they're hostile territory. It's occupied territory. I can't go anywhere near there. And they Many of them, intellectuals, are so far gone down this route. You go to a conference of the Political Science Association, which a colleague of mine did, and he said there was a panel of 10 political science professors. Every single one of them were all in the same line on multicultural identity politics. Every single one.
Let's say another question. Right there? Yeah, sir, right, stand up, yeah.
You mentioned that some of the starting point was in the 60s. Can you, and of course if you read Rules for Radicals, and you know how Hillary Clinton was exposed to that, and devotee. Can you talk a little bit about some of the social forces in the 60s that might have become the seeds of that movement and of this effort?
Yes, I can. It's my generation, the baby boomers. I lived through this. I lived through the 60s. Historically, if you look at very often when you have wars, big wars, like in World War I and World War II, the decade following the war is usually a time of social change, and very often social dislocation. Soldiers are coming back. They either were not married or they're coming back after the war. And even though the 50s looked really stable socially, it actually underneath, culturally, it was like a volcano about ready to explode. It started in the late 40s. Most of the beat movement and the counterculture started in the late 40s and the 50s. Up in Greenwich Village, it was off the radar. Most people didn't know about it. Some of the great novelists at the time, they were the ones that gave rise to the counterculture of the 60s, but they were there in the 50s. As far as the social stability, you had the soldiers coming home from the war. They were completely devastated by the emotional experience of that war. They wanted to go back and recreate the stability of their childhood from the 30s and the 40s. And so on top of this turmoil at the intellectual and the cultural level below that was happening in New York City and Los Angeles and places like that, you had a rather reassertive conservative value system being more or less finding its way into television and the like. So it was a sort of a strange conflict. Well, that all broke down in the 60s. When the baby boomers, my generation, there were just so many of us. And started in 64 with the free speech movement in Berkeley. And the universities were full. There were just a lot of young people there. They grew up in comfort. They didn't grow up in the difficult times of the 1930s where nobody had the luxury to worry about how you feel about anything. And so it was a generational rebellion against the World War II generation. And so the New Left culturally saw that this is a great opportunity. It's not just free speech, but also sexual liberation, frankly. I mean, that was just like
It's kind of like a mini French Revolution in American society, wasn't it?
It was. It was a cultural revolution. And it happened, I mean, actually, you would think that it happened below the radar screen, but if you lived in the 60s, and I see some of us were at that time, it was not, it was a bad time. You know, remember Kent State? You know, Kent State went, I mean, the National Guard was brought out in Kent State and students were killed, shot. And, you know, if that happened today, we would have incredible riots. So it was a time of turmoil. That's where it started, and it was generational.
One more right here.
I'm thinking back in my earlier days as a student, comparing the American Revolution and what really determined is a French rebellion, that to call them both a revolution is perhaps a little confusing for students. And then I'm thinking of studying Jefferson when he was in Paris at the time that the revolution, just at the time that the French rebellion was breaking out, and his comments and his abhorrence, his horror, and he couldn't wait to get out. And yet the revolution in his own country was inspiring. I wondered if you could comment, or am I in the wrong track?
No, that's an absolutely excellent question. Yeah, sometimes the nomenclature we use confuses things. I admit that. It's best to understand what we call the American Revolution as the War of Independence. That's really what it was. It was not a social revolution of one class against another. It was the American people rising up against a distant ruler in London. It's true there were some social elements to it. Some Tories were richer than others, and many of them went to Canada. But it was not a social revolution. It was a war of independence. The French Revolution was a social revolution. It was conducted by, increasingly by disenfranchised poor people who came into Paris and further radicalized it, and first went against the aristocrats, then went against the clerics, and eventually cut off the head of the king. And so it was truly a revolution in that sense, and therefore set the model for later on the revolution in 1848 in Europe, and then eventually the Bolshevik Revolution in 1970, which were also social revolutions and upheavals. And as a result of that, the liberalism of the French Revolution was extremely radical, not only in the sense of its violence and create the first terror in the name of liberalism occurred in the French Revolution, but it's also the war on the church. That's an element that we did not have. As I said, religion in America was an ally of liberty. In France, they treated the church and Christianity as the enemy of liberty. And that divide is with us to this day.
Now, I want to take the prerogative of the last question here, and that is, loved your book, and I've recommended it heartily. One thing I wish that you had probed a little further, okay?
I'll do it now.
And that is, you started the history of liberty with the Enlightenment, and a couple times you hint at sources before the Enlightenment, moral and spiritual resources of the Christian faith. And so what are the resources of the Christian faith, you think, to help restore and ordered liberty? And how might a Christian university like ours make a difference?
Well, first of all, I'm mindful of this, and I've had some talks with other intellectuals about it. And the short answer is that I was talking about liberalism as a movement. And the American Constitution and Declaration is not just about liberalism. I would not argue that the Constitution is some kind of a reification, if you use a fancy philosophical word, of John Locke's classical liberalism. It's not. It takes elements from it. But our Constitution is made from many different sources. Even in the history of the broad history of the Enlightenment, Hamilton thought about liberty very differently than Jefferson did. But to answer your question is that the genius of the American system was it took the respect for the individual soul, which is the essence, one of the essential points of Christianity, that the love that God has for the individual, particularly in the Protestant tradition, is very compatible with the classical liberal ordered liberty idea as understood by the Founding Fathers. So it wasn't a matter of inventing something new, it was just simply a matter of each side respecting the integrity of the other. And if you go back far enough, I would say that all the good things that I particularly find in liberalism as I described it, tolerance for your love of your neighbor, respect for your neighbor, respect for their opinions, respect for the individual, and the idea that morality is individual. These are all Christian notions. And so John Locke didn't invent them. You know, I probably should have said that, but the book was kind of long, and I had to get to the point. And, but
okay.
But it's a good point.
All right. Any thoughts about a Christian university like CCU and its contribution just in this whole
I'd
thing?
love to see a course about the Christian philosophical origins of classic liberalism. How about that?
There you go. Okay. That's the challenge to our political science department. Let's give it up for Dr. Holmes.
Good job. All right, we've got a few announcements as we close here. First of all, you can buy Dr. Holmes' book out there in the hallway. We have a few for sale out there. And Dr. Holmes, can you stick around to sign a few books for us?
Yes. And also a paperback version is coming out soon.
Great.
It has a really cool cover on it. I won't give it away.
I also want to make sure you know of some of our upcoming events. Cal Thomas is going to be speaking here Thursday, October 5th, Journalism in a Post-Truth Fake News Culture. And Dr. Sweeting here will be moderating that discussion as well. On Friday, October 6th, we're having a full-day symposium on the true impact of marijuana here in Colorado with experts from a variety of different fields. So that'll be here at CCU. And then our October Distinguished Lecture Series will include Rebecca Heinrichs. She'll be talking on how to stop North Korea and provide missile defense systems for America and our allies. That'll be October 16th. You can find out all of this at centennial.events. Just go to centennial.events. You can find all that to RSVP. But thank you all so much for coming out. God bless you all.